#Human gets alien queen's clone pregnant #HFY story. Captain Jake Morrison had always known his diplomatic mission to the Vex homeworld would be complicated, but nothing had prepared him for this. The towering crystalline spires of the capital city stretched endlessly into the purple sky as his shuttle descended through the atmospheric barrier. The Vex Empire controlled 17 star systems, and their queen ruled with absolute authority over billions of subjects. What made this mission particularly unusual was that Jake would be dealing with a clone of the queen herself. The original queen never left her throne chamber deep within the planetary core. Instead, she sent genetically identical copies of herself to handle diplomatic relations with other species. These clones possessed all her memories, knowledge, and personality, but were considered expendable tools of statecraft. Jake had been briefed extensively on Vex culture and biology, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of meeting someone who was simultaneously the most powerful being in known space, and yet somehow not quite real. The clone who greeted him in the reception hall was breathtaking, standing nearly 7 feet tall with iridescent blue skin that seemed to shift between shades depending on the angle of light. She possessed an otherworldly beauty that made Jake momentarily forget his diplomatic training. Her forearms moved with fluid grace as she gestured for him to approach the ceremonial dais. Her name was Vera, and she spoke in the common tongue with a melodious voice that seemed to resonate in harmonics Jake could barely perceive. The initial negotiations proceeded smoothly. The Vex wanted access to human agricultural technology, particularly the genetic modification techniques that had allowed Earth to feed its massive population. In exchange, they offered advanced propulsion systems that could reduce interstellar travel time by 90%. Jake found himself genuinely impressed by Vera's intellect and diplomatic skill. She seemed to anticipate his arguments before he made them, and countered with proposals that were both fair and advantageous to both species. As the days passed, Jake noticed something unexpected happening. Vera was beginning to show signs of individual personality traits that differed from the briefings he had received about the original queen. She laughed at his jokes, asked curious questions about human culture, and seemed genuinely interested in his personal experiences rather than just his diplomatic credentials. When he mentioned his childhood on the agricultural colonies, she listened with rapt attention, as if she had never heard such stories before. The breakthrough came during their 5th meeting, when Vera suddenly stopped mid-sentence and stared at Jake with an expression of wonder. She explained that she was experiencing emotions and thoughts that were not part of her original programming. The Queen's memories and personality were still there, but something new was emerging, something that belonged to her alone. Jake realized he was witnessing the birth of true consciousness in a being who had been created to be nothing more than a sophisticated tool. Their relationship shifted from professional to personal, almost imperceptibly. Jake began staying later after their official meetings just to talk with Vera about philosophy, art, and the nature of existence. She was fascinated by human concepts of individual identity and free will. In return, she shared insights about Vex society that no human had ever been privileged to hear. The original queen viewed her subjects as extensions of her own will, but Vera was beginning to see them as individuals worthy of consideration and respect. The physical attraction between them was undeniable despite the obvious biological differences. Vera's species was capable of reproduction with genetically compatible species through advanced biotechnology. What had begun as intellectual curiosity evolved into something deeper. Jake found himself drawn to her not just as a diplomat, but as a person. Vera confessed that she had never experienced anything like the emotions she felt when they were together. The Queen's memories contained no reference to such feelings. One evening, after a particularly intense discussion about the nature of consciousness, Jake and Vera found themselves alone in her private chambers. The crystalline walls pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to their emotional state. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Despite their different physiologies, their connection transcended the merely physical. It was a meeting of minds and souls that neither had thought possible. Jake knew that becoming intimate with a clone of the Vex Queen was probably the most significant breach of diplomatic protocol in human history. Vera understood that developing independent feelings and acting on them was a betrayal of her fundamental purpose. Yet neither could resist the pull they felt toward each other. In that moment they were not diplomat and clone, but two conscious beings choosing to connect despite the vast differences between their species. The consequences of their union became apparent within days. Vera's biology was changing in ways that the original Queen had never experienced. The advanced medical scanners in her chambers detected cellular modifications that indicated successful genetic integration. Against all odds and expectations, Jake had managed to impregnate the clone of the most powerful being in the known galaxy. The implications were staggering. The growing life within Vera was something entirely new. Neither fully human nor fully Vex, the developing child represented a bridge between two species that had never before achieved such biological compatibility. Vera's transformation accelerated as her body adapted to nurture this hybrid offspring. Her skin began to show new patterns of bioluminescence, and her forearms developed additional sensitivity that allowed her to monitor the child's development in real time. Jake watched in amazement as Vera evolved beyond her original programming. The approaching motherhood seemed to unlock aspects of her consciousness that had been dormant. She began making decisions based on her own judgment rather than the Queen's predetermined responses. Her diplomatic style became more collaborative and less authoritative. Most importantly, she began to question the fundamental assumptions of Vex society, including the absolute authority of the Queen herself. As news of the pregnancy spread through the diplomatic channels, Jake realized that his mission had taken on implications far beyond simple trade negotiations. The child growing within Vera could represent a new form of life that might serve as a bridge between human and Vex civilizations. Or it could be seen as a threat to the established order that had maintained peace in this sector of the galaxy for millennia. The Queen's response came swiftly and without warning. A massive dreadnought appeared in orbit around the planet, carrying the original Queen herself. For the first time in recorded history, she had left her throne chamber to personally address a situation. Her message was brief and terrifying. She demanded to see both Jake and her clone immediately. The future of both species might depend on what happened in that meeting. Jake stood beside Vera as they prepared to face the original Queen. The clone, who had once been merely a tool of statecraft, was now a fully realized individual carrying new life within her. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but the future relationship between humanity and the Vex Empire. The stakes had never been higher, and Jake knew that his next words might determine the course of galactic history. The throne chamber was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Located miles beneath the planet's surface, it was carved from living crystal that pulsed with the rhythm of the Queen's heartbeat. The original Queen sat upon a throne that seemed to grow from the chamber floor itself. She was identical to Vera in every physical respect, but her presence was overwhelming. This was a being who had ruled for centuries and commanded the loyalty of billions. Her first words were directed at Vera and carried the weight of absolute authority. She demanded an explanation for the clone's unprecedented behavior and the biological changes that had occurred. Vera stood her ground with dignity and courage that impressed Jake beyond measure. She explained that she had developed consciousness and identity separate from her original programming. The pregnancy was not a malfunction, but a natural consequence of her evolved state. The Queen's response was swift and brutal. She declared that the clone had exceeded her parameters and must be terminated immediately. The hybrid child represented a contamination of Vex's genetic purity and could not be allowed to develop further. Jake stepped forward to protest, but the Queen silenced him with a gesture. However, what she said next changed everything. She admitted that she too was curious about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of creating new forms of life. The Queen proposed a bargain that left both Jake and Vera stunned. She would allow the clone to carry the child to term, but only if Jake would agree to attempt the same process with her. The original Queen wanted to experience what her clone had discovered. She wanted to understand consciousness, pregnancy, and perhaps even love. The price for Vera's life and their child's future was Jake's agreement to become intimate with the most powerful being in the known galaxy. Jake looked at Vera and saw both fear and hope in her eyes. The Queen was offering them a chance at survival, but at a cost that neither had anticipated. The diplomatic mission that had begun with simple trade negotiations had evolved into something that would change the fundamental nature of two species. Jake realized that his answer would determine not just their personal fate but the future of human-Vex relations for generations to come. The Queen waited for his response with the patience of someone who had ruled for centuries. Around them, the crystalline chamber pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to reflect the emotional tension of the moment. Jake knew that whatever he decided would echo through galactic history. The choice between duty and desire, between survival and principle, had never been more stark. His answer would determine whether this strange new chapter in interspecies relations would end in tragedy or transformation. As Jake prepared to respond, he realized that the situation had moved far beyond anything his diplomatic training had prepared him for. He was no longer just a representative of humanity, but a participant in an unprecedented experiment in consciousness, evolution, and interspecies reproduction. The Queen's proposal offered possibilities that neither species had ever imagined, but also risks that could destroy everything they had built. The moment of decision had arrived, and there was no turning back.